Okay, so now we'll be switching gears to introduce our next talk, which is a panel discussion on scaling and deploying XR projects for enterprise. Our moderator today will be Tim Bajarin, a leading industry consultant and futurist who has been with Creative Strategies since 1981. He's renowned for predicting the desktop publishing revolution and identifying trends like multimedia. His experience in technology adoption cycles and marketing consumers has been widely recognized through his appearances in major publications and TV networks. And he's also our moderator today, so I'll let him get started and introduce the rest of the panel.
Well, good morning, and thank you for being here with us today. As she mentioned, my name is Tim Bajarin. I'm what you might call an old tech exec. Since I've been doing this for over 40 years. Luckily, I do it from here in San Jose, which is my home, and so I've been able to watch the Silicon Valley grow. Basically, from when I was here growing up, it was orchards, and now it's Silicon. So it's a completely different city and area, and we're pleased that you joined us here in Silicon Valley. This particular session is a really interesting one because as you possibly know, and if you're in this area, you know that the world of what's known as virtual worlds and XR, as this industry is now focusing on that term as opposed to metaverse, is starting to really garner some significant interest. Next week, we're going to see Apple make their entry in, and Apple is going to be a formidable player in this world. It'll be fascinating to see what Tim Cook and the team bring up. But as Ori Inbar said on the first day here, that there's an immense amount of work that has been going on in this particular field. And to a lot of people's surprise, the enterprise has been where not only the money has been outside of gaming, but they've been doing amazing projects in CRM, sales, service, simulations, using VR headsets, AR headsets, for years. In fact, let me move ahead on something. Barton and I created an actual website called the Metaverse Resource Center, and I think we put things on the handouts that have that for reference. But one thing about that particular piece of information and that website, and this is a truly amazing thing, we have 170 case studies of enterprises that are using AR, VR, and XR today. So when you actually look at this whole concept of the enterprise, it shouldn't be surprising that there's already interest. But what we're seeing in our work, and it's the same thing with all of these guys here, is that we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in enterprise to not only start projects, but to have to scale them. And we're talking in many cases, thousands of potential users that they would bring in for training, sales, service, whatever. So today, I am pleased to have, and if I can get back to our panel, Max Limper, who's the CEO of DGG, Carsten Lackner, Managing Director and CMSO at VR Direct, and Barton Goldenberg, President of ISM. Now I'm going to start by just going to each of them and having them tell you a little bit about who they are and what they do and what their companies do. So Max, I'll start with you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Tim. So really quick about our activities. DGG, we're a deep tech company from Germany, and we're working on making 3D pipelines scalable and making 3D accessible to more and more businesses by helping them automate their processes. So everything that has to do with getting content from different sources into different kinds of platforms. And we're mostly helping retailers like with their mission there, and also some industrial partners. So scaling XR for enterprise, the way we think about it is mostly scaling content creation pipelines and content optimization and distribution. So I'm really happy to talk about that, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion.
Okay, Barton?
So good morning. My name is Barton Goldenberg. I'm from the other coast, Bethesda, Maryland, a suburb of Washington. For the past 38 years, I've helped large global corporations apply technology, particularly in the areas of sales, marketing, and customer service. Initially, for the first 25 years, it was CRM. For the next 10, it was digital communities. And for the last 3 or 4, it's been the metaverse. And so I'll hopefully share some stories of what we've learned on how you scale up large projects in XR.
Yeah, Barton's being a little bit modest. He's actually written 3 books on the subject and is one of the top minds in this area of enterprise operations and scaling.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning together. I'm Carsten. I'm the managing director of Via Direct. We're a Germany-born company, but we also have an office in the US. And we see ourselves a little bit as the PowerPoint for VR. So our platform should enable any guys of you to create your own VR project within 24 hours. That's our claim. And it's really straightforward to really create VR solutions very easily. And we are specifically working together with big enterprises like Nestle, Porsche, Siemens, Mars to scale. And this is why we're all here, to scale their internal projects. And you saw on the slide of Tim already that there are use cases like training, manufacturing, onboarding, and this is what we are specified on.
Okay. So when you leave today, we're hoping that we're going to be able to leave you a series of principles or an outline of actually how you go about not only starting this project, but developing it over the a period of time to where you actually can scale it operationally correctly. Now, we're trying to cover a lot of material in a very short time, but I'll start out the first bullet point that I would add, and if you're taking notes, is fundamentally you have to start by defining what conceptually we call a business case, but it's really the use case. What is it you really need to accomplish? And Barton has done quite a few of these, and he has a key point that I want him to bring up about this first step.
So as Tim knows, it's fine to say, on the sales side, I want to make my products more visible to my customers, or I want to do virtual tours of my factory. On the marketing side, I want to integrate XR into my product offering and market effectively. Or on the service side, I want to use remote assist and so forth. But you can't choose a use case. What you need first and foremost is strong executive sponsorship. And over the years, I've watched so many projects either succeed or fail based on executive sponsorship. An example, at ExxonMobil, a global oil field services company, we launched a very important global technology initiative with them where we had great support, and the project soared across the world as this gentleman pushed the concept globally. And then as he left and others came in, sometimes it went down in importance, it went back up in importance, depending upon the executive. And that's just a classical situation. It's happened. There was one, Jaguar Land Rover, which is a British company, but the US executive team was incentivized on getting in a particular system on time so they'd get a bonus, but they were out of sync with the European approach, so they pushed it into the United States using the European approach. It failed. They got their bonus, but the system failed. So if you don't have that strong executive sponsor that is willing to fight and push aside all of the roadblocks in the way, I don't know if that project could ever succeed.
Yeah, and in my experience, and in my particular world, I actually consult more with the tech sector. And I've seen these type of projects fail because you did not have what I would call an executive sponsor who actually took the reins and worked with you to make it happen. So that's a particular very important point. Now, having said that, the other issue here is you still have to define, and that's your first bullet point here, is what is it that you want to accomplish? And so I'll get some feedback from you guys on this.
Right.
Please go ahead, Max.
Okay, real quick, like first thing that came to my mind was like, I mean, 100% agreed, of course. Executive buy-in is so important. And I think especially in this economy, we're seeing that like businesses are going back to focusing on their like essential like parts of the business that they deem so relevant that they cannot live without them, right? And most often XR is not a part of that. So we're seeing many layoffs, we're seeing a lot of restructuring, and the question is really, do you want to, as a company in this space, right? Do I want to work with businesses where XR or 3D is part of their core strategy, or is it something that is rather considered like an experimental project because hey, we have some budget and I read an article in Harvard Business Review that we need an XR strategy, so okay, let's do a POC. And then a year later, the economy takes a nosedive and it's like, wow, is this essential budget? No, let's get rid of that. And it's so sad for everyone involved. So getting that executive buy-in is super important. And I see a lot of companies, or many that we are working with in the retail space, for example, they're saying 3D and e-commerce, right now, it's something that you see here and there, but it's not the standard. But in 3 to 5 years, when it becomes a standard, you don't want to be late to the party, right? Your company should have that strategy and the content pipelines and everything in place so that you can stay ahead of the competition and be ready, right, for the next generation of e-commerce when buyers get used to these experiences. Absolutely. And that's a whole different momentum. And being in for the long term is much more satisfying and meaningful to everyone involved. So I 100% agree.
I can also totally agree. I think the main 2 points already mentioned is you need to solve a pain that is there. So you really need to have a solution to a pain that is existing in the company. And the second one is really to make it very easy for them to scale it to have long-term success. So this is really important to have this executive buy-in. And then, I mean, there's another point on our list that says you should develop a pilot project. And this is sometimes also the way to get in there, because we're sometimes talking with departments and they are not really directly at the executive level. But enabling these departments to have a pilot use case, building a lighthouse that really solves their pain points. This could be an essential door opener for the executive level, and then you get the buy-in for the executive level. But when it comes to scaling, 100% agree that executive buy-in is key for that.
So while I do want to get to the next point, which is the pilot, but one of the things that strikes me is, one, it'd be great to have that executive buy-in. But to some degree, if you're under that executive, you got to sell him on that, right? And that selling has to include things like competitive advantage, first mover, et cetera. Barton, you've dealt with that a lot.
So it's not just pain. In the XR industry, it's also gain. And what I mean by that is not everybody has a pain right now to apply XR. But many people, and typically have to be a pioneer, that's what we're looking for initially, that is willing to look at XR as an opportunity to take, in this case, e-commerce to the next level or whatever. Now, to get to the executive, to convince the executive, there's really 2 or 3 things you can show. Increased revenue, lowered cost, better customer engagement. Those are typically, will ring in the ears of an executive. But I think the way you have to approach it, I'll give you 3 very quick examples. We've got a customer out in Oregon called Fall Creek. They're the largest manufacturer of blueberry bushes in the world. So they sell, 80% of the bushes that are grown in the ground are Fall Creek bushes. And the challenge is a customer from Romania might call and say, I want a blueberry bush and it grows in this climate. Can you give me other examples of that particular, type of variety? And so what this company has is a need to do virtual tours of their various farms and nurseries around the world. And there's the case where XR plays a critical role to cost effectively help a customer see any type of blueberry bush, high chill in the north, low chill in the south, to be able to quickly pick a particular variety. Here's another example. And so it's easy to talk to the executives and say, listen, we're going to save money. We're going to have prospects come more quickly to us, and we can really improve our sales. So that's just an example. And I'll give you just one other quick one.
But maybe let me just jump in there, because it's the 3 things that you mentioned is exactly like you're solving these 3 pains to get the gain. So I think it's really like to have this long-term success. It's really about, like you said, like solving these 3 issues is long-term success to reaching this game. And then adding the magic of like what Max said, like solving this fear of missing out thing, that you then are really like a first mover. I think when these magical points come together, then it's really a long-term success. Because otherwise your budgets get cut as soon as it's like, okay, it looked nice, but it helps nobody.
One more quick case study. You'll know the company well, but so NASA in this country is the National Aeronautics Space Administration, and they put together an Orion space program to Mars. And there were 3 large competitors, it's not important, that were bidding on the project. And one of them happened to be Lockheed Martin. And what Lockheed Martin said is if we add XR capability in how we build the spacecraft, if we can show them that we can build a better, safer spacecraft at a lower cost by applying XR overlays in building the spacecraft, then we can differentiate ourselves in the eyes of NASA from that of just, let's just say, Boeing or other companies that were competing. And so they used it as an opportunity, and in selling that, Tim, to the executive team, that was pretty much a slam dunk. They said we can differentiate ourselves from the other 2 competitors by applying the XR technologies in the build of the spacecraft and then promote that to NASA as better than the competition.
Yeah, getting the executive on board is really critical because first of all, he's money bags, right? Or he or she are the money bags. But ultimately, you have to sell it to them unless they are pioneering themselves. And we've been privileged to work with some CEOs who are very progressive and are willing to do this. But a lot of companies, they don't have the pain points. They don't still see that yet. Carsten, you mentioned the second point that we have here is develop an actual pilot project. And let's start with that because you've done quite a few pilot projects already. And Max, I think you've done some too.
Cool. Yes, like I said before, it's initial to have these like lighthouse, this first pilot to really then show the success and like you mentioned, Barton, the gains that you can have from using any kind of XR technology in your company. And we've built some pretty nice cases, for instance, with Nestle, and they're using it for an internal purpose, but also for an external purpose. They have a website that you can easily access from outside. It's henry360.nestle.com, where you can see virtual tours for their facilities, for the headquarters in Geneva, and then go around. But we also realized like safety trainings, and so these were like the two major pilots that we did. So the first one was really this onboarding training, which solved exactly like the use case like you mentioned with the blueberries, to get people to see how beautiful the office in Geneva is, to get a message from the CEO, and this is a worldwide thing that you can approach by your browser or your mobile phone, tablet, or even in your VR headset. So this is pretty straightforward. And if you have one of these really like major use cases, we did this also for Porsche with the product demo of the Panamera. And so if you have these lighthouse projects, it's very easy to then convince the executive level or also like the employees and go from there. And what I really like about these lighthouses is that if you show something, and we did this like 3 weeks ago with Mars, if you showcase this on the facility ground, they did a safety training for their facilities, and you see the blue-collar workers there putting on the VR headsets and are totally amazed because the production line is physically right behind them, but I can see them on the VR headsets. And I mean, everybody in the room has ever had a VR headset on it and tried it and is like, yeah, okay, I know this shit. But these guys are really like trying this for the first time, and they really see, wow, I can do it now from home, or the people in the headquarters can also see my production line, my coworkers working there doing their stuff. This is also really amazing, and this is really like convincing for everybody and creates emotion.
Max?
Right. Yeah, thanks. I think that makes a lot of sense, and we'll just keep it short and by adding like proof of concept, right? That's how it's usually worded. Word that we have heard coming up as proof of value, and I think that's a nice way to think about it, right? Like first and foremost, the mission of like doing this together here for a couple of weeks or short like amount of months is really just coming up with a proof of value. So here's a tangible outcome, but it's not a demo to show once to executives and then throw away, because like I think many people have enough fantasy to imagine that, okay, it could look like this and this, but what really matters is like, what are we getting out of this as an experiment, right? And then taking that confidence to unlock a larger budget and strategy that helps you like take it to the next level and helps you stay ahead of the competition or whatever your objectives are, right? Like increase your revenues, your customer engagement and so on, based on some numbers that you get it through that POC.
Yeah.
So really not just creating a tech demo, but securing that like business outcome in a way, right? Proof of value.
I actually want to build on that, and I think it's very important. I think you have to manage a proof of concept, a pilot, a lighthouse, however you call it. I think you have to actually manage it. You can succeed by planning and implementing and executing a pilot successfully, and you can fail by not doing it successfully. And I think it's something that you really remember, especially in a global corporation with an enterprise rollout, all eyes are going to be on how successful was that proof of concept. So it requires a great deal of upfront planning. You want to metric and monitor it by, in a particular area. How many visits do we get to the blueberry bush factories or farms? How many today? You measure it halfway through the pilot. How many more are coming? You measure it at the end. You look at if there's a lift in revenue as a result of them visiting. But you really have to plan a pilot very carefully. There's a great deal of training of the users of the pilot to make sure they know how to use it effectively. There's a great deal of communication. If you get a win during the pilot of communicating it effectively across the organization, there's a need to make sure you have a pre and post report going to the executive team or the governance structure to make sure they see the value so they can continue to promote it. So it's not just something we try, as I think you've already suggested, Max, but it's something that we plan, we execute with great care, and we make the pilot successful. That's how I think you have to approach it.
Yeah, and I think that when you actually are talking about major enterprises, they already have a level of discipline in their business operations where that is actually critical. Because if they don't have the ability not only to create it properly, but to measure it, it becomes really problematic in the sense of the selling it to everybody else.
And I remind you, one other thing that's, always funny, particularly in an enterprise implementation, right or wrong, the proof of concept, the lighthouse, the pilot often becomes the system long term. So in other words, to roll something out across an enterprise, a global enterprise, is very challenging. So sometimes you'll start in a division and then expand it to a country and then to multiple countries. But be a little careful that the proof of concept doesn't become the de facto system forever.
Yeah.
And I cannot even stress enough, like what you said, or Maxio as well, is these measurement topics. So this is really key, that you have figures also, how is your project running, where are people dropping off to then optimize. We come to this later, but I think this is really important to mention at that point, that you really need to have the analytics as well on the pilot, but also on the business perspective. So this is totally key.
Maybe I think we probably want to move on to the next point, but just one example, to give it a very concrete example. We worked 2 years ago almost on a POC that was really small, but for a really big retailer in the US. And their task was okay, can you help us convert these V-Ray scenes into a PBR-ready format, and GLTF, and that's what we did. And it was driven by the technical people, the point that I heard earlier, right? I think you mentioned it, it's you have a bottom-up or top-down motion, right? When it comes to these POCs or the strategy, and bottom-up can work, but in that case it was okay, this is a very specific problem that I think we know is very relevant for this industry, but not everyone in the executive level might even know what we're talking about there, right? So that was clearly a bottom-up motion, and we did this small POC, and what we included in the script that converted these files was an automated report that would show you graphics about time savings. So it's here's what it would have taken an artist. We categorized the assets automatically in different categories. Okay, this is a 1-star asset. It is not real-time ready. It takes 2 days to get it prepared. And this is a 3-star asset. It takes only 2 hours. So we did already some more sophisticated clustering and did a whole report work for free on the side because we thought it might benefit everyone midterm. And guess what? The engineers didn't understand that first while we were doing it, but later they took that report, took it to their executives, and 6 months later we signed a multi-year deal that we're still like working with and like helping them scale up so many internal use cases because they were able to understand the benefit and put numbers next to it and say, wow, okay, this actually saves us a lot of time and money, so we are more confident. And frankly speaking, I would not want to do it another way because it is so much more satisfying knowing that you're actually helping someone solve a real problem and making everyone happy because you're saving them money and time. And it's more satisfying than knowing, oh, this was a one-off. Yeah, I got paid. Okay, move on. We want to rather be in for the long term, right? So,
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So if you're following the bullet points, the first one was define the business strategy, get executive buyout, develop a concept for the pilot project. Now, the third one on our list is select the appropriate XR technology and team for the pilot. So that's two different things. One, you have the actual need to go out and find the right technology partner. And that's one of the things that's very important with AWE. You're going to go to the show floor and you're going to be able to talk to a lot of different companies and you're going to see their demos, and that's going to be an important part of helping you understand the technologies needed for that. Do you guys want to weigh in on that? Because we've been on the show floor like a lot of people here, and I got to tell you, there's an immense amount of great solutions, but how do you choose it?
Tim, I actually want to flip that one around to you for a minute. So Tim is also very humble, but he's a real guru inside Silicon Valley for the world's best companies. So I know, Tim, you track the industry, and I know you know an awful lot of the vendors. I'm just curious in your own take. Are the current XR vendors flexible? Are the current XR vendors really fixed in what they're offering? How do you see it right now?
Well, again, depending on the headset maker and the companies behind them, as you notice, I don't know if you noticed, just from the keynotes and stuff that was shown so far, is you've seen a big shift. So from what Magic Leap showed yesterday was all enterprise. What you saw from Lenovo, if you go to their booth, it's all enterprise. If you talk to most of the vendors, they're focusing on enterprise because that's where the money is. There is money, of course, in the gaming side, but the real dollars for most of these vendors is going to be enterprise. The good news is they're learning through the process to figure out how to make their stuff better. And so in that sense, there is a better flexibility because they are adapting and creating for the needs of the enterprise right now. If you ask me who to choose, I would go through an actual serious shootout, as we call it. I would have multiple vendors coming in and testing what they have against what my particular criteria is and what my particular needs are. But that's where you really bring in some kind of either outside consultants or someone who really knows what they're doing to actually help you with the assessment of the technology. Now, having said that, making the decision on which technology you use is critical for success. And that's why at this particular show, it plays a very important role for you to go on the show floor and to actually talk to the vendors and ask them, can you do this? Can you do this? Can it do this, et cetera?
Okay, if I jump in there, it's exactly what we see at the moment. So we're a software company, and we see a lot of the hardware product developer are really like coming also to us and wanting to work together, to collaborate, because like you mentioned, there's a lot of software on the gaming market, but there's still a few lacking use cases in the enterprise sector. And I think it's really cool to see that over the last 1.5 years, this connection gets even stronger, and then that we are really working integrated with the Meta, HTC, Pico, Lenovo. We will be in the store as soon as the headset launches. And so this is really key for us to have these partnerships. And of course, we as a software developer, we're only like trying to fit all the needs of the hardware companies. But as you said, making a vendor assessment is super important. Also when it comes to software players like us, because we are only solving like one part of a use case, but there are like plenty others. And sometimes we say like, hey guys, we're not the right people you're looking for. But we know there are other companies in the market who can solve your issue much better when it comes to really manipulating things in VR or something like this. And then of course we forward it because the branch is so stalling at the moment that it's just cool to see all these companies on the expo floor and showing off.
I would pick up on one thing Tim said, and that is this concept of a shootout. There's tremendous technology on the floor. I spent most of yesterday just walking around, and some of it's been here a year ago, and a lot of it hasn't been here a year ago. So, and a lot of it may not be here in another year. So it's not always easy to determine, who really you should lock in on. But the concept of a shootout is very important. Here's just my advice, having done this really dozens of times. You want to make sure that the vendor is telling you what they can solve today, not what they can, what they're planning to solve in the future. That's the first thing, because a lot of vendors will want to sell futures versus today. That's the first thing. Second thing, though, is to make sure you know what you need. So if you actually look at the process flow of what you're trying to accomplish, visits, virtual visits to blueberry bushes, there's a process flow, and there's certain things that you need to happen to allow that visits to take place. Well, now you're asking the vendor, don't tell me how wonderful you are. You're telling me, show me how you would go through this process flow and how I could apply your technology at each of these stages so that it could happen with excellence. And what that does is it changes the whole dynamics of the vendor demonstration or presentation, because it puts it on your terms in terms of what you need versus how wonderful and great they will claim themselves to be.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and it's a really interesting and fun discussion. And having been in this couple of times from the vendor side and taking a step back, I feel, as you said, there are so many different companies in the space right now popping up, and new startups popping up every day, and everyone claims they can do everything, right? And so it's rather smart to measure a vendor by what they can actually do right now. And we have been in this a couple of times. The term shootout was mentioned. I have heard the term horse race. So it's like I have 5 horses, and DGG is one of them, and here's the task, get these 100 assets ready for real time, and show us how you do it. And I love it because this lets us execute our we're having engineering backgrounds, most of us at the company, including myself, and this lets us execute a no bullshit request for proposals, show what you can do, and it's kind of a cleanse at the same time because it also shows you where you are not good at. So in our space, for example, we're really good at optimizing 3D assets automatically. We have a CMS, but it's not our main focus. So if someone says, I want a CMS, I could say, yeah, let's go in and apply, but then they might say, okay, do you have a sophisticated versioning concept, and can I link products to sub-products, and can I do this and this and this? And this puts me in front of a decision saying, do I really want to go after this, or do I have my focus area? So that's what I meant by cleanse. It's it helps you to figure out as a vendor also, is this really a good match? Am I the right company to help this client? And I think that's good for everyone in the industry, because what we're seeing organically happening through these mechanisms is some kind of specialization. It's I'm not in automotive, so if anyone is, please correct me if this is bullshit, but let's say I'm BMW and I want to get some parts for my car. I have Bosch and I have Continental. I probably know that Bosch is really good for some parts and Continental for others, and there are some where they both have an offering. So this will happen as well. We will be the Bosch for some parts, and others are going to be the Continental for other parts.
The way to address, at least the way I think you should address it, it's a very important point. So there will be certain vendors that are going to be stronger in certain areas than other vendors, and there'll be some where they're commonly good. So what do you have to do as the buyer? You need to write down, what is it, the functionality, the business functionality, the technological features, and the user-friendliness criteria that you require given the culture of your company and the objectives of your project. Write it down. So let's just say you say to a vendor, there's 20 things I want you to show me during your demonstration. dealing with either business functionality, technical features, or user-friendliness criteria. And if you have a script, and what we typically do is we say to the vendor, you have 5 minutes to tell me how wonderful you are and the best company in the world and why we should buy from you. And then we want you to be humble and put that all inside your pocket. And we're going to go one by one down the list and you show us how well you can do the first, the second. And we have literally a group of people that score them 1 to 5. 5, they do it outrageously well. 1, if they don't do it. And no, you're not allowed to sell anything future. It has to be today's. You have to show it. And what it does is it chains them to the floor, right? Their feet are on the ground, and then we add the numbers up, and literally you get a winner. But I want to ask 2 questions. Max, you mentioned, you touched upon CMS, content management system, and one of the critical issues I know that you have spoken about, and I'd like just to raise and ask you about, is when you talk about an enterprise implementation, scaling content is a critical issue. And Max, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Barton. So we work a lot with retailers, and I think depending on what XR enterprise use case you're looking at, this might be an issue or less of an issue. In retail, it's a big issue. It's like I'm already having a huge catalog of items that I'm selling, and I have all kinds of media to help me sell those items online, like product imagery and videos, for example, right? So now I see 3D popping up as a new medium. I see studies from like Shopify, Wayfair, from others that are showing that 3D has a big potential to increase conversion rate, reduce number of returns, and so on. So I'm actually already having a rather narrow frame of like, okay, these are my business objectives. I want to increase my conversion rates. I want to like stay ahead of the competition, right? And use 3D media in my store and so on. And in that narrow frame, like the main issue quickly becomes the content. It's like, where in the world should I get all these 10,000, 50,000 assets per like season? Where should I get them from, right? And there are different sources that people are like using for that. Like for example, modeling services like Modelry by CG Trader, or like using these 3D model marketplaces to get some props for their scenes quickly, whatever they want to do. So like others are using like photogrammetry, now like AI, and then like 3D from image is early stage, but it's becoming more and more of a thing. And then finally, you have all that content that is already there that has been modeled for virtual product shots for their catalogs, where you have already so much content in 3D, but not in the right format for real time, right? So getting this content into like a real-time ready format that allows you to show it in the web browser, in 3D, in AR, in your floor planner, and even like internal in-house applications like virtual store planning and so on, that becomes critical quickly. And then it's all about scaling these pipelines. And frankly speaking, there are not enough 3D artists in the world to do this for all the retailers.
That's a good example.
So you need to automate.
One of the criteria you'd have on your list of how easily do you scale and can you show it. But Tim, I have a question for you on technology. There might be an announcement on Monday in a town called Cupertino on new technology in the XR industry. And I wonder, how do you put that into perspective versus what is out there today and what will be out there tomorrow?
Well, again, nobody truly knows what Apple's going to release until Tim Cook takes the stage on Monday and tells us what he's doing. But from what we gather, and I talked to Cook about this a couple of times personally, he's very much AR focused. And he's adapted to the term XR, probably begrudgingly, but he's going to, whatever they're going to do, their headset is going to try to take advantage of what existing software they have in iOS ARKit. And then, knowing them, they're going to probably do a new version of an OS for VR. And then get the developers to work on VR apps based on that OS to expand.
AR, I think you mean.
I'm sorry, AR apps, yeah, or XR actually. The biggest issue right now for all of us here is we don't know what Apple's going to do. Apple could literally give us a new platform next week that fits all of our criteria. We don't know. And everybody in this room, I'm sure, is going to be watching to see, what Apple's going to do. But Apple's a formidable company who will, I believe, give us a serious optional hardware solution. And I suspect that a lot of enterprises are going to take a look at that right off the bat. From the enterprise standpoint, they just become another one of the potential suppliers. And you have to look at that. It's hard, again, I know a little bit about what they're doing and some of the stuff that's going on there. But until we actually see what Apple's going to release, it's really hard to state anything but Apple will be a hardware player that you will need to consider as a part of any enterprise program going forward. I want to finish, because of time, the scaling issue was one of our key points. You did a good job, Max, on that. Another thing that's in our bullet point issue is creating a deployment plan. So once you've got the pilot successful conducted, you have to now figure out how you're going to actually deploy that. Now, Barton, you've actually done a lot of these deployments. What is the first step in the deployment process?
So Tim, I think this is very important. We look at 3 streams in the implementation plan, streams. One is the people stream, one is the process stream, and one is the technology stream. And what typically people, particularly the IT folks, like to do is to focus on the IT stream and optimize it. But here's what we all know. If we don't have a clear process that we're trying to solve and the IT is supporting that process, what's the real value of the IT? So what I like to do in an implementation plan is look at what process improvement do we need to do throughout the project over time, by quarter and then by year as we move out. Same thing on the people side. How do we ready the organization for adoption of the technology? What type of communication, what type of training, what type of incentive, what type of reward are we planning to give over the implementation period, and first by the quarter, the first year or two, then by year thereafter, to incentivize and get them to be ready to adopt the technology. Then we get to the technology plan, and typically what I think is important is you work very closely with your vendor, so I'm going to turn to my left in this case, or my right, either one, but the point is the vendor will tell you what they're able to do over what time frame in order to get it implemented. But again, it's not a technology implementation, it's a people process technology implementation. But Carsten, I'll be interested in what you say.
There's nearly nothing more to add. It's actually exactly the same like Barton said. What's on our side as a vendor is very important is to have a dedicated resource on the whole project management. So that we really have one person in charge in our team that's really taking care of the process. The whole 3 things that it's really like executed in a well format. Otherwise, I totally agree. It's these 3 steps that are major for having a successful deployment.
Max, anything you want to add?
Nothing to add to that.
Well, one thing I would add myself, just listening, is some governance. The governance structure you put into place. Carsten kind of alluded to it. You said we have one devoted project manager, but so too do you have to have a devoted project manager. And you may have to have a people sub-project manager and a process sub-project manager and a technology sub-project manager managing the streams. And that has to come up to some sort of a governance structure that is monitoring the implementation. Red light, yellow light, green light, and making sure that however you implement, agile or any method you use, you're regularly consulting with either the steering committee or the executive team or some governance structure, because we all know that these things don't get implemented cleanly all the time. And so you really have to make sure that when you hit a tough spot, you have enough governance in place that will allow you to then correct it quickly with the vendor or internally.
But honestly, Barton, this is like the ideal scenario. So what we see even at big enterprises is that you need to search for the right people who say like, okay, you are now my counterpart and I'll guide or I'll help you guide through the process and like really also steer some of the enterprises to go that direction. But 100% agree, if this would be the case on the enterprise side, this would be awesome for us as well, because you have then one dedicated resources with all the traffic lights inside and then go from there.
And you raise an important point. In any enterprise deployment, and we've all been in them, you know that people change jobs, sometimes every 2 years. So if you are now committed to a particular executive and they move on, you're hoping the executive to come in is just as enthusiastic. So you have to be a little careful that you're at least too deep in all that you're doing on the governance structure.
All right, we have 2 more points I want to bring up, and we'll try to get them in. But if you've got questions, you can come up to the microphone, and we'd be glad to address them for you. Well, you're coming up. So one other key point here is, so we're going through these bullet points, and we've executed to the point. How important is user training?
I think if I can answer for us, so the user training, so what we deploy is a software solution pretty similar to really like PowerPoint. So, and we would try to make it as easy as it gets for users to just use our software. And we have all these kinds of FAQs and stuff on our website, guiding tutorials, whatever. So for us, user training shouldn't be a big deal. But of course, like Max also mentioned before, you always get feedback from the enterprises and guide you through. So we always have like initial workshops showing off our platform. We have also like a dedicated resource for support and stuff. But initially, we're trying to make it as easy as it gets to enable users to just use the platform. And we also get the feedback that it's quite possible to do so. So user training for us isn't that important. But I think you guys see it some kind of different, because as more complicated the use case gets, the more user training gets important, I think.
Okay, sir?
I would make one observation, Tim. I actually think it's process and technology training. So the best effective training is when the user, sales guy or gal, or the marketing person or the customer service person, sees the process that they're implementing to sell, to market, to service. And you talk about the process flow, and you say, this is where we're using the technology now, and you teach them how to use it. And then maybe this is another place we're using the technology, and you teach them how to use it. So what happens is the technology becomes a part of how they do business, because they're following a process that's agreed to by the organization. So it's both process training integrated with technology training.
Okay, sir?
Yes, Oscar Castillo with Northrop Grumman. So we've been talking about readying your people or training your people. As we've been digitally transforming, one of the areas that I see that we've been struggling with is with like user adoption internally. And Max, you mentioned earlier, coming from a company with a lot of technically strong people. That's us as well. And those people don't always translate into having the strongest people skills. And the combination of technology with people is a whole new. Even if you did have some really great people skills, you might not have the technical background to speak to this specific combination of skill set. So it's an area we're struggling with, and something that I appreciate that you added as 3 pillars. I don't know if you comment anything to give us some guidance there.
Barton.
So in 1986, it just dates me to about where Tim is. I wrote an article called The 3X Factor. And this is what I said, and it's a completely stupid concept, but it's been adopted by many, many companies around the world. I said, for every one piece of information that you ask a user to give to the system, you have to get at least 3 back in order to incentivize them to use the system. Why 3X? Maybe it's 4X, maybe it's 2X, but the point is, you got to get more from it than you give it, and that will drive user adoption. So what typically happens is an organization says, we're rolling out an XR program, you will use it for this, 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 and this. And most people will say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and you go out and try to do it. They're not getting a whole lot back. You flip the table and you say, listen, I'd like you to use it for this, but as a result, I'm going to give you these things back. And I'll give you an example of a 3X in just a second. And you'll see that if the 3X is in place, people will want to use the system because it gives them more back than they have to give. And what I find is in all failed implementations, it's not the 3X factor, it's the 1/3 factor. I'll give you 1, you give me 3. And that doesn't work, okay? The employees say, I'd rather do it a different way. And so an example of a 3X factor, if you're a sales guy, and now let's just say using XR technology, and somebody says, you have to put into the system, I don't know, the name of when you visited a customer, what they said, the call reports. Sales guys hate to do that, right? But in return, I'm going to deliver you new leads through the system. I'm going to deliver you your forecast versus budget every month through the system. And I'm going to deliver you, I don't know, the latest deliveries of the blueberry bushes. Well, it's in my best interest to turn the system on and give you the call report because I'm getting 3 back. And that typically is the reason why projects, user adoption does not get a high ranking. And I really think you should go back at every step of the implementation and ask yourself, how does that decision impact the 3X factor?
Maybe just jumping in there, it's like the last point on our list is like analysis. And this is exactly what you mentioned. So sometimes it's even like just the data that you get out of it, like Max mentioned before. If you get a nice set of data out of it, it's also like pretty satisfying for the people to see their project is successful and is viewed by or used by the other people's.
Sure.
I think that user adoption is really critical. And so I like the 3X thing or whatever. But I tend to look at that like they have to feel like it helps them do their job better, right? They don't want to go back to the other way, which is reward in itself, right? Am I changing this process now to where I'm not making these mistakes, or it's easier, I don't have to reach to do this? And I was just wondering, you gave an example, but it wasn't an AR example. You went to something else. So if you're talking about AR, do you have an example of your 3X and what you would give them?
Yeah, I'll try to give one. And by the way, I just want to reinforce what you said with a little bit of light humor. Change is very difficult for anybody. Changing the way you do a process, changing the way you use technology. I joke, just go home tonight and say to your spouse, I want to flip which side of the bed you sleep on, and all hell will break loose, okay? Never mind adopting a new technology or a new process. But let's go to Siemens, which is a great organization that these gentlemen are much more familiar with than I am. But Tim and I do a podcast, and a couple of podcasts ago, we did the Siemens case study. And it was about digital twins, which they believe is the foundation for the XR industry. And they've done some incredible things on applying their technology on the factory floor for simulating and optimizing and testing various machinery as it builds, let's just say, a product for one of their customers. And what they did is they took the entire factory and put it inside the metaverse in this case. And they actually built a factory, it was for Beijing in China, in the metaverse, and then they optimized it, and then they put it back out and took those improvements into the actual factories in various countries that they work with. And they documented a 20% improvement in productivity of that particular factory enhancement as a result of optimizing it in the digital twin inside the metaverse or the virtual world. So let's talk about the 3X for that for a minute, okay? I wanted to set the case, and then let's look at the 3X. So what we're asking the company to do, the person that's buying the technology and using it, is would you please put it on your machinery, measure the various simulations and measure the outputs and measure the testing and so forth. That's what we're asking you to do and set it up. That's the one I'd like you to give to us. Us being Siemens and the digital twin. Let's look at the 3X coming back. I'm going to now take the output, the actual measurements that come off the factory floor from the machinery, and I'm going to put it inside the digital twin, and I'm going to optimize it. And I'm going to come back with recommendations to you as to how you can improve the factory productivity and optimization on the factory floor. And I'll come back with 3 or more observations that will say to you it's worth putting in the testing equipment, because what I get back from the digital twin more than offsets the pain of having to put the equipment in and measure.
Maybe to jump in there with another example, what we see is we do a lot of safety trainings. And so the thing that the companies we're working with are putting in is like 360 images or videos, and they go from there and just deploy like safety trainings they normally do on site. And so the benefit is that you just reduce your travel costs, you reduce CO2 footprint, and of course the quality of the training is always the same, because if you have on-site training, it varies in if the trainer has a good sleep or not, or if the train was late or not, and so you have always the same quality. So this is another example of the 3X.
Great example.
Yeah.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Just adding a little something to the whole discussion, saying like, I think you mentioned engineers are not always thinking about like the people and the other aspects, and I think that's very true. And if you're on engineering schedule, there's this article, right, by Paul Graham, like the maker at the manager schedule. If you're on a maker schedule, it's like I have my big task, I'm sitting here implementing this ticket for 2 days, in the ideal world, that's great. But you're not thinking about that other people are on this manager schedule, which means like, oh, I'm in between 2 meetings, let me squish that phone call in, and maybe I can have a coffee with that person, and like you're always busy. Like if you're on that schedule and someone says, hey, would you mind like reading this documentation is only like 30 pages, will not take you so long. And then if you have questions, can you come back here and so on? No one does it, right? So it's like you got to think about your business users, like inside a company, inside their different like departments and functions as like users where you want to get that buy-in and that 3x factor, meaning like if I put 5 minutes of my time in, it better be a good return for myself, because otherwise I just like wait if someone like punishes me for not doing it, and it's not the best outcome for your process. So if you need a strong buy-in from people who help you deploy the headsets or like do user training or whatever, like you better make sure they're incentivized, right?
So in summary, because we're almost out of time, we've given you multiple points. Define the business strategy and get executive buy-in, develop a pilot project, select appropriate XR technology, create a deployment plan, develop a concept for scaling, conduct user training, and the last one, we don't have time to get into deeper, but we brought it up, was monitor and optimize. Having the stats of why this works is really important, and you're going to have all kind of ways to measure this going forward. Well, we hit our 000. Thank you all for coming. The gentleman will be here a few more minutes if you want to catch up with them real quick or ask them some more questions. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you to our speakers today.